I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, chaliye ji, Bismillah.
Chale, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to a wonderful conversation. And I've been looking forward to it so much to speak to my friend in absentia, I should say, Mehjabeen Abidi-Habib. We've met just a couple of times, maybe 3 times, but we know of each other's work, and I've really admired her all these years. So I'm so delighted that she's here today. So Mehjabeen, above all, is a scholar who studies the deep continuities of people and nature. Very few people do that, not just in Pakistan, but globally. And her book, Water in the Wilderness, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2016, is an extensive story of the intertwining, resilient people and of freshwater rivers, lakes, and glaciers across the mountains, deserts, and coastal areas of Pakistan. Mehjabeen lives in Lahore and consults internationally on how we can cope with climate change while treating nature with understanding, respect, and love. So few people understand that. Let me say that again. So, Mehjabeen, you ready for a long, relaxed conversation as if we were having a cup of tea?
Oh,
Yes?
lovely. Thank you so
Okay.
much for asking me, Simi, and thank you for your appreciation. These are themes so close, I think, to our hearts.
Mhm.
Actually, I think they're close to human hearts, but we don't always give ourselves permission. We're very conscious of being technically
Yes, that
correct and
permission to be
expert.
human.
Yes.
That's right. So all the poetry and the lyricism, which is should be part of water, part of the water story, has been thrown out of the window. The spirituality of water, the sociology of water, the psychology of water. So let's delve in some of that today. First of all, I'd like to hear your story. How did you come to water? What is your personal history? Let's hear some of that.
Well, I consider myself a child of the Indus River. I was born on the banks of Tarbela Lake, where my father was an irrigation engineer in the early 60s. And my early childhood was spent looking at the spillway spray of Mangla Dam and the rainbows that used to come all over that gorgeous spillway. As a young child, I remember my running barefoot in the Jordan Valley, where my father was commissioned to consult for the Jordan Dam. Uh, and I remember going into that valley, which now is underwater, in running through the streams and tributaries of fresh water and seeing a scene that I think Christ would have seen. It was so untampered, it
Mhm.
was full of wildflowers, and I caught my first guppies, which are small freshwater fish, as pets in those rivers. So, my father really frames my relationship to water. He was awarded a Sitara Khidmat, a service to the nation, as part of the team of designers and engineers in the early life of Pakistan who made one of the great water irrigation systems of the world. 50% of the Muslim population of India had suddenly moved to dependence on this one river system, the Indus River system, and a small core group of engineers designed a system of dams and barrages and canals that became a wonder of the world in the 60s and 70s. So it was a very heady time. But as I grew up and surrounded by this engineering of water, certain things started to happen when I was in my undergraduate that drew my attention to re examining engineering water. For example, the IUCN had something called the World Commission on Dams. And this was an extraordinary exercise in which they brought together the powerful, the engineers, the policymakers, people like my father, and the powerless, those who were affected by the construction of dams, the disturbance and re engineering of natural systems, local communities, and had dialogues with them and really began uh, it gives us goosebumps when we think about this incredible dialogue of the love affair and the glamour, the Hollywood aspect of engineering water, and then the underbelly of what happens to people's lives when these dams are made. So there was a transformation beginning as I grew up as a young person, and I started my first job straight out of my master's working with the remote communities in Gilgit-Baltistan and looking at water really as a family and as a woman's enterprise. And so it was the opposite end of the spectrum. And the wonderful part of my story is that my father and I grew together, and he gathered appreciation of the social context of water and the uh, part of water that defines it as the ultimate uh, thing of nature and a symbol of nature. And as I grew up and started to re-examine water, my father also had a change of heart. And as he grew older, he became a small-scale irrigation engineer and changed completely and began to believe in how water
That's an
belongs to
amazing
nature.
story.
So that's a little bit of how
So
my
imagine
life is shaped by water.
your father's story is also amazing. Has he written about it somewhere? About his change of heart? Engineers rarely change their minds or their hearts. Did he ever write
Well,
about it somewhere?
I don't think he wrote very much about it, but he said that you are the continuation of my story. Your life and work is a continuation of my dialogue with water. So it was an ultimate acknowledgement of father to daughter and a beautiful gift from a late father to continue this dialogue with water.
Well, that's so
So
wonderful
it
because
was,
I
he
want to
passed
ask,
the baton, although he was a very great engineer, I am not.
I wanted to ask you what inspired you to write your beautiful book, but well, I suppose you've answered that partially. But tell us more.
Um, so, would you like to know more about the book, or would you like to know more about the people who figure in the book?
No, first you tell me what inspired you to write it. Tell me in detail. Go back and think about it. And then we'll talk some more about its content.
All right. So, actually, that was also a time in Pakistan when I started working on this book along with my two other dear friends and colleagues on this book, where a whole host of new knowledge came to light about the wetlands of Pakistan and their importance. So, whilst we are almost obsessed as a country with the economies and the great opportunities that harnessing the Indus River system has given us, uh, we have failed to understand the other freshwater rivers, glaciers, and lakes that define the water system of Pakistan in a more comprehensive and holistic way. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, a very large project called the Wetlands Project in WWF was initiated for 7 years, in which we got primary data about these lakes and these far flung and little understood rivers and these communities and the life inside these water bodies. And so there was a whole lot of fresh science that came in. So, with a water orientation as part of my identity, and with this new information accessible to me, we decided to go to all these places, photograph them, and photograph their beauty, their culture, the mysticism and poetry, and the relationship, the physical relationship with water that very little parts of Pakistan, very few people in Pakistan understand. They're outside our collective imagination. And the idea was to expand our collective imagination to bring the stories of these ancient interconnections between people and water to the fore through this book.
Well, that brings me to the next question. Can you give us insight into how the communities that you studied, how do they relate to water? This wonderful historical connection you're talking about, and how is this connected to their hopes for the future? Because we see such a bleak future ahead. But I'm sure that communities who have been anchored in water for so long, maybe they look at the future differently. So tell us.
Well, we have the great privilege of living in a very ancient part of the world where nature and people have coexisted for millennia. And our troubles are very recent, really, because of the Industrial Revolution and the new ideas of development and modernity. But the coexistence starts in Mehergarh and Harappa, and it has endured for millennia. People have ways of living within their means, with, of course, ups and downs, but they have not been devastated with the types of global threats and overuse that we now face in the world today. So really, the endurance is like a melody that reaches, hundreds and hundreds of years, that we can begin to listen to understand how is it that humans were once part of nature and not the sort of destroyers, the to use a Hindu metaphor, the Kali Ma that we are seeing in the Kali Yug of destruction
Mhm.
that we are now in. So that is the the melody we're listening to as we go in to understand how communities in Pakistan, in very, very dramatically different ecosystems and water situations, live. Let me give you a few examples to to remind us of how water and communities are so interlinked. Let's take Hunza to start with. Hunza is a geography which is made with two things: human hands and water. Without these two things, this would be a vertical desert. And these two things have intertwined with each other over centuries to make this magnificent landscape, which is actually man made, um, that we see and admire so much today. Water in Hunza is the governing factor for how societies are structured, how communities work together. And the single theme of this song of coexistence is how to instate and renew norms of how people behave in relation to water, and justice as to how sharing of water happens in habitations. Let me give you an example of what a living thing this still is. So I have a house together with my family in near Gilgit, and the village water channel that comes out of the glacier is just behind our house. So last summer, when there was a sudden burst of heat in the summer, the glacier of our village actually discharged so much silt and so much water so quickly that the water channel, which is all human handmade, burst. So the water supply was disrupted. And the ancient rule of Hunza society is that every household must offer the services of one male for all water works, including repairing breaches. So my husband had to roll up his sleeves, take a bilcha, a spade, and join all the heads of the households to go and repair this breach. And within 3 hours, this enormous force of water was tamed back into the water channels that flow through the village. And it was a very social exercise in which there was lots of conversation, and there was a surfeit of hands to make this happen. Nobody waited for the government. They said the government can't really, we are disappointed. They can't do these works for us. We've always done them ourselves, and we know we're going to have to manage this. So that is, a living continuity of how things are organized around water. And now I'd like to take you to further south in our country to the Cholestan Desert. Now, the Cholestan Desert lies on the eastern flank of Punjab, sitting more or less in the middle of our country. And this is a desert that archaeologists have discovered the sand dunes are dated to 10,000 years of age. So it has been a dry desert for, imagine, 10,000 years. And so one would ask, well, what does water have to do with this dry desert? Who lives here anyway? This is a blank slate. But that is not at all the case. Actually, this desert is governed by ephemeral water, water that comes and disappears. And all life in this desert is governed by ephemeral water. So in the winter, there are rains in Cholistan, and water collects in natural depressions in the desert, which are called in Cholistani tobas. These are freshwater ponds, and the whole of human life, which is dependent on animals and nomadism, converges around these tobas for about 6 months. And each clan has sharing rights on each toba, which is divided up so that the animal load is not extended too far, and the clans don't have fights and wars about whose water is it. These are very old traditions, and over 6 months, the animals drink the water in the peripheries of the tobas and trample the wet sand and actually place their excrement on this wet sand so that the wet sand becomes fertile. And next spring, it begins to bloom with grasses and shrubs that are so valuable for the animals. So from February to May, the animals drink and eat of these natural, from these natural tobas. And then when the heat is extreme, the tobas dry up and they become salt pans. And the nomads of the Cholistan then take their herds of animals to the edge of the Cholistan desert to where there is agriculture and settlements. And they sell their wares, their animal-based hides and other crafts, all mostly derived from animals, milk, meat, hides. And in exchange, they get water. And of course, now they get school and health. So they're not asking for very much. But what is important is that this is a highly co-evolved system, which we should not try and change because of our ambitions for turning a desert green or for fencing it off from our neighboring countries or from dividing it up into private property. This will destroy this thousands of years of coexistence. So that is how we have to understand, respect, and revere this extremely finessed balance between people, animals, and water. And then finally, let's move down to our coast. And I'd like to take you to Somyani, which is a little bay about 120 kilometers from Karachi. And there is a mangrove forest where a fresh river water drains into a lagoon, and seawater and fresh water, salt and fresh meat. And here there is a settlement that goes back to Harappa. We actually have Harappan finds and archaeologies from Somyani Bay, and it is still inhabited by fishing communities who who realized about 20 years ago that they are sitting on a very precarious water system, which is being disturbed because their freshwater inlet in the Hub River has been channelized into a dam that supplies Karachi with fresh water. So they realize that there are two things that their whole life depends on if they want to stay in Somyani. And that is that they must uh, safeguard the mangrove forests that grow in Somyani, and also that their livelihood is dependent on something that the mangrove creates, and it's a breeding ground for, which is shrimp. So Somyani's shrimping industry is the source of their livelihood. The people of Somyani realized that both the mangroves and the shrimps were under danger. And there's a beautiful story of revival and regeneration from Somyani, in which the community was able to replant and grow their mangroves, so that our GIS surveys show that there's a 40% increase in mangrove cover due to community innovations with the help of scientists in how to regrow mangrove forests in situ. And also, they analyzed that during the peak fish season, there are these fishing nets that they were originated in Bangladesh, and the net size is so tiny that it catches baby fish and baby shrimp. So it catches all the children that are going to grow into a rich harvest for them and over harvests their lagoon. So they then took on a community campaign to destroy these and outlaw these nets, so that the shrimp could grow to full size and they were controlled as to when they are harvested. So now in Karachi Fishing Harbour, in the auction, if you go, the most prized shrimps of the largest size come from Somyani. So there are these amazing stories of hope and understanding and action that come that we recorded in this book. And you see that I think the key to the community's hopes is their ability to understand and be sensitive to the changes in their environment and adapt to them. And that really is what resilience is all about.
And that's really the direction in which we need to go. The children of this world know where we are heading and what catastrophe lies in front. The adults don't seem to understand it. Even children in the capitalist countries are calling for change, are asking why we, the adults, are destroying their future. And it is
Yeah.
so heartening to know that in amongst our communities, they are thinking of the future. And it's like, what do they say, back to the future, that they are coming up with some of the things they did before. And I fully agree with you that some of the traditional methods of sharing and caring in community are really important, and that with the kind of industrial capitalist growth that we have espoused, the individual becomes very important, and that community sense is lost. So there's so much to learn from these communities that have been isolated and have therefore very luckily escaped all the maladies that we face on a daily basis. So it must be really wonderful to have visited all of them and to
Yeah.
have met them all. So we were talking about wetlands, and as you know, from this year onwards, the next decade is dedicated to regenerating wetlands across the world, and we in Pakistan also need to do a lot of that. Just like you used the Cholestani word for ponds, in the Urdu, in our languages too, there are all those words, jheel or talab or johad. They were all open depressions where rainwater filled in, and there's so many romantic stories. Like I remember my dadi telling me that when they would go to the talab to bathe, how all the guys in the village were told to stay away, and then all these ladies went there, and this was ladies time, and then for 12 hours they splashed around in these things. So wonderful stories like this. So how do you think that the freshwater systems that you have worked with through all this work that you have done, not only in Pakistan but in other countries as well? So you're familiar with all of those. So how do they shape our landscapes? What will they look like in the future? And
Hmm.
how does their future define our future? Because we tend to always separate the landscape and the geography from human existence.
Hmm. Well, I think it's wonderful that you're remembering how our culture binds us. to nature and water. Uh, but there is, nature is not only uh, beneficent, it can also be very powerful and frightening for human beings. And it's well that we remember that, because it is, we are its servants and we belong to it. It does not belong to us. This is a very modern concept and a misconception that we need to unravel. So let me give you two examples of how our landscapes are shaped by water and how they can be reshaped before we know it and we don't have control. Let us first look at the tremendous glaciers in the northern part of our country, in the Karakoram range. And I'd just like to bring to the fore that our part of the world is called the third pole. So there is the two poles, North Pole and South Pole, that we all know about. And they're great masses of ice and glaciers and water bodies where polar bears and penguins live. But there is a third pole, and the third pole is a gigantic reservoir of water held in towers of ice. And this is where we live. It's the Karakoram Himalaya Hindu Kush range. This is the third pole. It's the great reservoir of fresh water that feeds approximately 2 billion people on Earth and sustains their lives. So within this third pole is something that applies specifically to the Karakoram Mountains, which is called the Karakoram Anomaly. So whilst the Himalaya, for example, the Himalayas are, it is considered that the glaciers of the Himalayas are melting, and there's a lot of alarm about this. In the Karakorums, geographers are telling us that there's an anomaly. Some glaciers in the Karakoram are actually expanding and some are melting. So we must be very careful when we make these generalizations about glaciers melting. It's not always the case. Glaciers are enormous beings that are actually like knives that go through cake dough. The cake dough is our landscape, and the knife is the glacier itself, that wedge of ice. They have shaped our valleys and our river systems over millennia, and they continue to do so, except that the timelines of glacier movement far exceeds human life. So we don't always know that we are being shaped by glaciers. But glaciers can also behave in very tyrannical and frightening ways. When glaciers, should I continue?
Yes, go ahead.
So when glaciers receive sunlight and the energy of the sun and heat in the form of thermal energy, glaciers absorb it and become animated. They move. They can move in many unpredictable ways. They can have small outbursts in which gushes of water from inside the glacier are released, melting inside, but not having following the regular pattern of flow that rivers receive. Sudden bursts in which villages, roads can be destroyed. At another scale, glaciers can actually move as a whole. And they, in the last time this happened, for example, in Upper Hunza was 120 years ago, when the Khurdopin glacier from Shimshal moved and cut the village of Passu, which lies on the Karakoram highway, into half, changed the course of the Hunza River, and destroyed things all the way down to Attak and beyond. And this is recorded in British annals. So glaciers are these knives, basically, that can shape our landscape. So that is one of the great drivers of landscape shapers that we live in. The other one, and here I'd like you to take you to the other end of the spectrum, which is the river delta, the Indus River Delta, where for millennia, this delta has been a very benign presence. It behaves like the lungs of the Indus River system in that it protects from extreme weather events in oceans like cyclones, and it also creates this beautiful interface between fresh water and salt water in which mangroves, fish, um, red rice, which was traditional and is now almost gone, palla fish, they were the specialties of Sindh. For centuries, Sindh was known for this. And of course, cotton, indigo, these all grew in these delta areas. They were endowments of this thriving delta. But we have begun to dry up this delta because of the great engineering works that I described to you earlier, of which my father was a part. We have diverted the waters of the Indus to such an extent that the delta is suffering and is slowly beginning to dry up. And the very important thing that it received with the fresh water from the river was silt, which is food for organic food for the growth of the delta. Both of these things have reduced to alarming extent so that the delta is becoming less extensive than it has been. So it's like our lungs shrinking in the Indus River system. So these are some of the great shapings that water makes to our landscape and determines the health with which we and all other living beings really thrive or not. So we are at a very urgent time in human history where we are being called upon to, to transform from over-engineering and over-control, overestimating our powers, and as a consequence becoming destroyers in nature, and where we must transform to become healers and revivers and regenerators of the nature that sustains us. So that's a little bit of that. I'd just like to now answer the question about hope for the future. And in that, I'd like to go back to one of my father's memories, which brings the story to full cycle. As a young engineer from Harvard working on the Indus River system, he recounted a story when he was an old man. He recounted it to me and he said, in the Sumro clan of Sindh, there was an elder mother, a grandmother, and her grandson and I were colleagues, and we told her with such excitement as she sat in her courtyard that we are harnessing the waters of the great Indus, the Sindhu River, and these are the marvels of food and growth and production that we're going to unleash. And she said, Beta, Sindhu Darya ki ragon mein pani roko na, use behne do. And when he was very old, he could not forget this advice from the Sumro elder. And you know, is this is the direction of the future. I want to tell you that the Yangtze River, which is also a very great river system of the world, has been studied in the light of climate change. And what Chinese scientists have found is that if they undam, remove the dikes on parts of the Yangtze River and let the old river floodplains of the river and the wetlands that formed when the river flooded come back into existence, the river would save China a great deal of money in disaster reconstruction, because the river, instead of being destructive, would then become a much more benign presence as it has been for millennia. So learning from the China example, Pakistan too is getting ready in this forthcoming decade through a program called Recharge Pakistan, in which the federal government and WWF and IUCN are all involved in uh, reconstituting, reviving the wetlands and river floodplains wherever it is possible in our highly engineered Indus River system. So the wisdom of the elders and the ways of nature are not purely the domain of science. There's a great deal of civilizational wisdom that we need to take account of and be a little more humble in how we treat this great mother nature that we are children of.
Well, certainly that's the message we all need to hear. And we need to hear this eventually from every mouth. Because unless there is that collective effort, that sense of community to take us forward, we are going to be caught in the cycle. And when you mentioned about water not being about just about science, actually, water has just become about engineering and technology. It's not even about science at the moment. And I agree with you completely. It's the science of water, the art, the spirituality, the leisure activities around water, the
And the
nature,
craft of
food.
managing water with your
Yeah,
hands that is
absolutely. All
more
the old
sustainable.
traditional systems, and
Yes,
that mutually respectful relationship, as we say, and as the Sumbro elder was saying, you respect water, and water will respect you.
yes,
But if you don't, then you will see the fury of nature. We are seeing that already, the way our
yes,
systems are being disrupted. And on top of all this destruction sits us, man. Man sits over there. And
yes.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the fact that if we look right now at places where some of the traditional systems have survived, they are mostly propelled by women. Women who have held on to those traditions, have passed them down. And of course, through the centuries, they have been burnt as witches, and they have been locked up, and they have been marginalized and written out of history. We read about all the Kublai Khans and all the progeny. We don't read about the Mongol queens. So, what the men destroyed, they built, but we don't hear them in history.
Hmm.
So, my last question to you is any messages to women? What would you like to say to women regenerating water?
Oh, I think our time has come.
Mhm.
Um, our time has come because we have stewarded nature to sustain our families and to care for our elders and for our young. In the subcontinent, especially, research shows that women use strategies of prudence. So we carefully steward water and soil and animals to last us the difficult times. We have become masters and mistresses of
Mhm.
prudence. And alongside our local community and folk practices, the social movements of environmentalism and ecology have at their forefront women scientists, women activists, women advocates. So I think that the time is now where the combination of women's ancient relationship with stewarding nature and women's leadership in social movements is converging. And women's role in science also is converging. So I think that for young women and old women, this has become this decade is our time. It is our time to embrace the life-giving things that we have looked after for millennia and to bring to the fore the violences and the disruptions that the capitalist system and the scale of change that humanity has unwisely brought upon natural systems needs to be redressed and regenerated. Women are going to be the regenerators of the future. Our greatest hope is in women's understanding, action, and communalism of coming together to transform our systems of production and consumption. I think it's happening. We're just giving voice to it and we want to honor it. It cannot be stopped. It's like a wave of water.
Well,
Women's
that's all
basement.
music to my ears. And when I look around, I see the same resurgence. And I've been talking to young women in particular, but all women in general, that this century belongs to women. And as you're right, this decade belongs to us. And if we lose the opportunity, that would be real shame on us, because here is the momentum that we could really rise. So, Mehjabeen, thank you. I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed this session. It's been so
Thank you
different.
so much.
I'd love to talk to you again, and maybe we could have a session in Urdu so we could also, relate and go back to the communities that you visited. So I'm certainly going to do that very soon.
Thank
So
you very much, Simi. Thank you.
let
It's a
me,
pleasure to
let,
talk to someone who understands these issues so naturally.
so,
Thank you.
being a geographer, being involved in water, we have all that you were talking about the glaciers and the U shaped valleys and the Indus Delta. It was all music to my ears. And it is so good to find fellow travelers, and there are so few of us now. But as you say, we are multiplying really fast. So, thank you. It was wonderful
Thank
talking
you.
to you, and I look forward to doing so again. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.
So, ladies and
Bye-bye.
gentlemen, I hope you really enjoyed my wonderful conversation with Mehjabeen, and we'll bring you many more, and certainly we'll be speaking to Mehjabeen again. Thank you, and Khuda Hafiz.